So today I'm going to talk about the brain, and before I really mention anything, I do have to show you the parts, and I'm going to go deeper into it. So what you would have is you'd have the spinal cord down here, and coming off the spinal cord as you come into the brain, which is called the Medulla Oblongata. I put MO for Medulla Oblongata. And what I'm going to tell you is this is anterior here, this is posterior. And as the Medulla Oblongata comes in, we then have a big round projection here called the pons, which I'll put at just a P. And behind it, we have the cerebellum. Now you'll notice it says bell here as a bell. After that, you have the mesencephalon, also known as the midbrain. And that is attached to the diencephalon, which is made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, which we've talked about before, and an area up here called the epithalamus. Now, one of the things to remember is this was a tube. So you have a connection here called the inner thalamic adhesion. And this area here tends to have two hemispheres, and it actually contains cerebral spinal fluid. And this here area here is your third ventricle. So it's a fluid-filled cavity within the brain. You actually have four. You then have a tube coming over here, which is called the aqueduct of the midbrain. And then you have another big cavity here, which is called the fourth ventricle. Remember, this is an area that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And finally, you go down the medulla oblongata and join into this canal, which is called your central canal. And again, this is actually taking cerebral spinal fluid and wrapping it around the spinal cord and brain, goes around and then it gets reabsorbed there. And it is made actually in specialized cells roughly in this area here. And you have a couple other ventricles I'll talk about later. The cerebral spinal fluid is made of cells that are actually located here, and the other two ventricles, which I haven't talked about yet. You do have some in the ventricle here, which are called the choroid plexuses. Right now you have most of the brain. I haven't gotten to the big part, but the really big important portion covers this entire area here, and that's the cerebrum. So you have the cerebrum, this is anterior, this is posterior. Now, I am going to draw this again, and this time I'm going to draw it as if you were to take the brain and look at it upside down. What I'm going to do is you're going to see the cerebrum on the farthest area, and everything else is going to come out. First part of the brain that you talked about is the medulla oblongata, and there's a big lump up in front called the pons. Now, behind everything, you have another big area called the cerebellum. You have an area here called the midbrain, or mesencephalon. And the mesencephalon is attached to the thalamus, and then you have the cerebrum covering all of this. Here, it actually would be, this here is a cerebrum, and there's a reason why I drew this here. So you have the midbrain here, you would also have your pituitary hanging off here, and the reason I drew this is I want you to know about the blood vessels. If you remember from the cardiovascular lecture, I told you about how you had two vertebral arteries coming in here, and they fuse together to form what's called the basilar artery coming up here. Now, the basilar artery has a bunch of blood vessels branching off of it, and what you're noticing is these branches are happening in the pons. Now, you do have the anterior spinal artery too, by the way, which is coming down this way, and so these are the pontine arteries. But before that, we have the vertebral arteries coming in here, and they branch relatively quick to feed the inferior portion and inferior and posterior portion of the cerebellum. So they're called the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. These will fuse together and form another artery here called the basilar artery. Now, the basilar artery has a lot of branches, and these are around the pons area. At the end, these are going to branch, but right before it branches, you have two arteries coming here, which are going to feed the cerebrum. You actually have one prior to that here, which is going to feed the cerebellum. And so this one right here is your anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Come in this way, in the cerebellum. And over here you have this artery that's coming to the back of the cerebrum. So we call it your posterior cerebral artery. Now this actually will branch, and it's going to form a circle here. So together, all this is your circle of Willis. And here we have your posterior cerebral artery, cerebral for the cerebrum. You also have two big arteries coming and feeding this area here. Now these two are your internal carotid arteries. And as it joins a circle, it throws an artery to the sides. We have the posterior cerebral artery. That would make this artery here the middle cerebral artery. The reason is we have two arteries coming off here, which are your anterior cerebral arteries. And you have a lot of areas where you have communications. They're actually the circle of Willis. And what you see is you can see how the entire brain gets blood supply. And yes, these can actually branch here, and you can have branches here, and you can have branches everywhere. Now, big thing to know is the brain needs a lot of blood. It actually, for every heartbeat, ends up taking about 25 to 30% of the cardiac output is just to feed the brain. And so now we have the arteries of the brain and the sections of the brain. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about every section of the brain, and you'll see why I did it this way. But right now, you actually have the basics. So you have the medulla oblongata, the pons, cerebellum, you have the midbrain coming this way, and you have the thalamus. The thalamus would be actually just over here, and you have the cerebrum here. A lot of different areas and a lot of different functions here. For instance, you do have in Medulla Oblongata all of nuclei. You have the pyramids. All of nuclei would be about here. Pyramids would be around this area here. There is one area that I think is really important for you to know because it travels through almost the entire area called the brainstem here, which is your reticular formation, and it is involved in a lot of different things, and it connects a lot of the different sides of the brain. Medulla Oblongata is really tends to be a relay center between the spinal cord and the brain and the higher brain functions, and it's also involved in regulating basic life functions. It actually has an area that regulates the cardiovascular outflow. It has a respiratory center, so it actually is involved in respiration rate, and it has relays for somatics to the thalamus. You have a lot of different aspects of it which are going to be involved here, and it does link the brain to the spinal cord, which is really important. The pons, which I'm going to add color to it, is this area here. And the pons is actually involved in a lot of things. One of the big things it does is it connects the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum to higher brain functions. It also is involved in modifying the respiration drive of the medulla oblongata. You have a pneumotaxic center and a pneumotic center. And you do have part of the reticular formation here. The cerebellum. One of the big things to know about the cerebellum is that it is involved in coordinating movements. It does have different areas which send messages to the medulla, the pons to the medulla oblongata and to the midbrain here. So this here is your cerebellum. And it does have a structure inside which is white matter, which is called the arbor vitae, called the tree of life. Now, as we keep moving up, we end up coming to this area here, which is a midbrain. It has specialized tracts, which I'm going to use black because I need to use something, which send messages up to the brain to tell certain things to relax. And the mesencephalon, the midbrain, is involved in a lot of the coordination of movements. It also has a couple lumps here. The two lumps are here, which is the corpus quadrigemina. These two are, the top ones are called the superior colliculus, the bottom one is inferior colliculus, and they are actually involved in coordinating reflexes with the superior is involved in taking visual stimuli and causing reflexes due to those stimuli. The inferior one is involved in reflexes due to auditory, and you have the pineal gland here. Now I drew the hypothalamus a little high, it should be over here. So we have the midbrain here. Then we get into the diencephalon, which is made up of the thalamus, which is this area here, the hypothalamus, which is here, and the epithalamus, which is up here. And the epithalamus has something that's really important, which is a pineal gland, which will hang out here. This would be the pineal gland here. Now the pineal gland is involved in formation of melanin, which is involved in pretty much day and night cycles, and it does have other aspects to it too. Now the thalamus has a lot of things that are involved in moving aspects of sensation from one area to another. It also has an area which is on the lateral side, is involved in feedback with the cingulate gyrus, which is involved in emotion in the parietal, and also it sends messages with the cingulate gyrus and parietal for emotion and sensation. And so the thalamus is involved in limbic system. It's involved in sensor, which is emotions. It's involved in sensation, telling your body where sensation is coming from, and also a lot of motor. So that's the thalamus and the epithalamus. Hypothalamus down here is part of this, and it does help. It is involved in appetite drives. So for instance, thirst, hunger, and sex are all involved in the hypothalamus here. And the hypothalamus, it's also a connection between the brain and endocrine system. And so the brain and endocrine will actually function pretty much together. The hypothalamus is also responsible for the sleep-wake cycles, and you do also have these two little bulges here, which are called the mammillary bodies, which are involved in feeding reflex. Now, the big one, the one I'm going to spend most time, is this big area here, which is the cerebral, and I'm going to redraw it. If we are looking at the anterior portion of the cerebrum, so we're looking from anterior to posterior, what you'd see these two big things called hemispheres. You have a lobe here, you have a lobe here, and this would all be covered. And you'd have a connection here, which is called the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. We have this division here. You have a big division here, is called the longitudinal fissure. Now, the longitudinal fissure divides the cerebrum into two hemispheres. You have the corpus callosum connecting them. Now, the other thing that happens is, inside here, if we were to cut this, we would have a big structure here, which is also connected, and it has an area here, which is fluid-filled. So this area here, and this one here, are both fluid-filled. And I mentioned ventricles before. These two are your first two ventricles, which are called your lateral ventricles. And inside there, you do have the choroid plexus, which is making cerebral spinal fluid. Now, this here would be your thalamus. Your corpus callosum would be here. We'll do anterior here, posterior here. You'll actually see these bumps, which are called gyruses. And there are two big gyruses, which are separated by a deep depression called a sulcus. And this big sulcus is called the central sulcus. So the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And what you notice is two big gyruses here. So you have one before the central, so we call it the precentral, and one after, which is a postcentral. Now that we have the precentral gyrus and postcentral, so we have the parietal lobe coming here, and there's a little notch here, which has it's a sulcus. And the sulcus is important because it separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So this here would be your occipital lobe. Now, one thing you'll notice is right away, you're noticing that there are a lot of names which are similar to the skull. This sulcus here is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. Parietal for parietal, occipital for occipital, and sulcus because it's a depression. And you have another little sulcus here, and we have a big slit on the side of the brain, here. This is called the lateral sulcus, also known as the sulcus of Silvus. And you have another lobe here. Now this lobe will be your temporal. And so what you see that there's a depression here and here. So where these come together, here, you have your occipital lobe. Over here, you have their temporal, parietal's up here, frontal is here. And you have a lot of other interesting gyruses. Now, I'm going to talk about them. So we talked about the precentral, the postcentral. The other one that's really important is located here. It actually is part of all three of these, and it's called the angular gyrus. Now, the angular gyrus is involved in word choice and listening. It's also involved in reading and writing, depending on what side of the brain you're at. You also have three gyruses on the temporal lobe. One of them is your superior temporal gyrus. You have your inferior and the middle temporal gyrus. Occipital, you do have the primary, secondary visual interpretation centers, and you do have some auditory interpretation centers here in the temporal lobe, usually around here. Another very important gyrus to know about is if you were to lift this up, and here, you actually have another gyrus here. You have the insular gyrus here, and you also have another gyrus which is important called the cingulate gyrus, which I'm going to have to show you later. There's one area in particular here called Broca's area. And Broca's area is involved in being able to learn to use words. Now what happens is, the brain is actually arranged in a really interesting way. It makes a lot of sense. This is your motor cortex here. This is your sensory cortex here. So these two are involved in body movement and sensation. And parietal will be involved in interpretation, sensation too, back here. So you'll actually see interpretation tends to be kind of together. Frontal, you actually have the motor cortex. You have the area that's involved in premotor, which are movements that you've learned to use together. And this area here called the Broca's area is movement of things such as your mouth and for speaking in particular. You have long-term memories coming up here. You have an area here called the frontal pole, which is involved in personality. And some people have found that if you go inside and kind of scramble that area, you can change people's personality. Not necessarily a good thing, but people have found that out. So we do have the basics of the cerebrum. And one of the things which is important in the cerebrum is you have a lot of tracts running all around. And some of these tracts run from, let's say, from like this area here, like this. These are called your Arcuate Fasciculus. And one of them, if you notice, connects these two together, which are involved. It's a tract really involved in speaking. You also have longitudinal fasciculi, which run the entire brain like this. And these do send tracts within different areas of the brain. So you can actually use everything. Now, a lot of people talk about how you only use a certain amount of your brain. The truth is you use all of it at any given time. And the more of the brain that you use, the better it does. You do have the limbic system, which is involved in emotion, and it involves a lot of different lobes. You do have the hippocampus, which I will show you in class if you're in my class. And you do have a lot of different structures which are important in brain, which you'll see in class. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you just a basic understanding. And I hope this is enough for you. Have a nice day.